Twitter's the last platform I would have ever been on. It just felt so scary to me. But it's, I think as you learn more about yourself, you do these things that are a little bit more courageous. And looking back, you're like, how did you do that? It's like small incremental steps. One of the reasons I chose a podcast is because I felt like I have all of these years learning how to ask questions, how to listen, how to dive deeper into topics. Why not just use that same skill set into a different medium? And so that's where the idea came from. And then I just thought, what if I just take this clinical skill set and I can create courses and stuff with it? Because it just seems like it's not a huge leap. Multiple income streams. It sounds phenomenal on paper. And even for me, I was like, oh my gosh, wait, that means I don't have to worry about another blizzard because I've got like other income streams. But the things that I didn't quite realize until I was in it was, one, each of those streams, like to some degree, they still require upkeep. So that's one thing. And then depending on how big you've grown, they require their own management.
Hey Melvin, how are you doing?
Hey there, Mish. It's so good to see you. Hi, Rajesh. Really nice to see you as well.
Yeah, so this conversation is going to be a lot more self-reflective in nature. We'll go down your memory lane to see where did it all get started and what was the journey. One of the things that most of the creators have been very interested to learn from other people who have actually made it or who have actually gone a couple of leaps to achieve certain amount of success in the creator journey is, hey, at what point do I qualify as a successful creator, right? And usually the metric has been, can I earn as much money or more money than in my full-time job so that I could have a sustainable sort of living? So we'll talk about your journey, and we'll also talk about a little bit about the income streams and what are the ways in how you overcome uncertainty on a daily basis. And we'll also talk a little bit about what is it like to hustle between multiple platforms and your mental health. How do you take care of it? And a lot more topics, right? Awesome. So I start the conversation usually with one very interesting question, which is how would you introduce yourself to a stranger?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I usually honestly say that I'm a dad of a daughter, I'm a psychologist and a husband, and that's usually where I start. And then if folks usually ask me like deeper things, I'll mention, oh, I have a podcast, and there's usually like a conversation around. It used to be, what is podcasting? But now it's, oh, that's so cool because I think as podcasts have become more mainstream, and so usually that's where I start, and it usually leads to some rich conversations from there.
Nice, nice. You are a psychologist who has a private practice, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't have a current existing practice. I actually
Okay.
became a full-time creator right when the pandemic started. Prior to
Mhm.
that, from 2012 to 2019, I was doing clinical work and doing the podcast and all of that as a side gig.
For the folks who are pretty new to this field, can you also explain us what is the role of a psychologist? What do they do and what do they study? Can you throw some light around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Psychologists, they generally see, I think there's sometimes a stereotype of you have to be like really sick in order to see a psychologist. But I think the reality is, especially, I feel like every entrepreneur personally, I think, should have a therapist just because the nature of what we do is so erratic and volatile. And I think more than anything, it's just a place to be able to bounce ideas off, to be able to just talk about the how hard the journey can be. With I feel like especially on like social media and things like that, a lot of times the highs are emphasized, but we don't often talk about the kind of the boring days or the hard days. So psychologist generally does therapy, so counseling. So I was doing a combination of what's called testing. Basically, I did a variety of different testing. So I worked with like bariatric surgery. So individuals that were going to do like weight loss, like significantly overweight. And a portion of them will have a diagnosable eating disorder. And what I was trying to do was run a lot of psychological tests to see do they have criteria that actually meet criteria for an eating disorder, and if it does, then we recommend like delaying the surgery in order to in order to address the underlying sort of factors. So I was doing bariatric surgery evals, and then I was doing general like personality and career testing as well, and then I was seeing a handful of counseling folks as
Right,
well.
right. How did your interest in this field begin?
In psychology, that's a great question. So, my dad is an attorney, but he has a master's in psychology. And
Mhm.
I remember growing up, and honestly, I was not going to pursue psychology at all. My plan was actually to go to medicine and become a pediatrician. But I remember just growing up, I think a lot of like my friends would often come to me to ask these deeper things, and they would be open and share with me things they were going through. So I think even those early conversations, it made me wonder like about the brain, why people think what they do. It made me wonder about emotions, how all of that plays out. And I think especially without getting like too much into the details, I grew up in a family household that was pretty tough on multiple levels. And it made me realize like I'm grateful for the struggle, but the struggle also impacts me as a creator now. And I think I didn't have it in those words back then, but I think I had often been trying to figure out like, did what I went through in childhood, how would that sort of impact the career that I would go in and the impact that I would be able to have? Because I think the underlying thing for me has always been doubt whether I'm worthy to be a creator, even something like Twitter, right? Like we connected on Twitter, and honestly, like Twitter's the last platform I would have ever been on. It just felt so scary to me. I think as you learn more about yourself, you do these things that are a little bit more courageous. And looking back, you're
Mhm.
like, how did you do that? It's like small incremental steps. So,
Right. So once you completed your graduation, if I can recall, so you did not start your private practice immediately. Can you talk about the journey between your graduation to your private practice? How did the sort of shift happen?
yeah, of course. That's a great question. Yeah, so I did four in the US, it's four years of undergrad work to get a bachelor's degree. Then I did
Mhm.
5 years of grad school to get a PhD. And then I had a 2 years of like a postdoc and a fellowship. At that point, it was 2012, and I actually lived in a different state and was actually planning on working at a university I was planning on being a professor and also working at the counseling center on campus. But we actually got married in 2012 and then decided to move to a different state. So I didn't know
Mhm.
anyone. And I actually, at that point in I would say early 2013, I actually joined a group practice. And so this was like already an established practice. And what I was basically doing was seeing like a small number of clients in that practice. And then I was doing testing and assessment at a different facility. So I was freelancing is the best way to
Mhm.
put it, but in the clinical sense.
Right. Right. Tell us about the moment. I know that I've seen this in your YouTube intro about the time when you started thinking about multiple income sources and the private practice. Can you tell us about that moment where things started changing?
Yeah, I think for many of us, right? Like we grow up with this idea of we have to get a stable job, but I think our understanding of jobs has often been trading time for income. And so
Mhm.
when I was in the private practice, like I was seeing, I'd say around like 25 clients a week, and then I was doing about two tests, like assessments a week. And what I realized is generally like if a client like canceled or if I got sick or something like that, like because I was like basically an independent contractor. It was not a salary position. So I only got paid if I saw clients, and then I didn't get paid if I didn't see clients. And what I just began to understand early on, I was like, I don't know how sustainable this model is. And we live in Philadelphia, which is like northeast part of the US. And in 2015, we got hit with the nor'easter, which is basically a big snow blizzard. And I ended up having to cancel around 22 clients in the span of a couple of days because the power lines were down. The roads were really like very icy, so you couldn't even really drive on them. And so I just realized like either these events are gonna keep happening and I was gonna keep getting stressed out because we were actually saving for the down payment on our first home at the time. And I just thought there has to be a different way of doing it. And I connected with two of my colleagues that were in the group practice at the time, and none of us had taken business or marketing classes like ever. And so we just started like reading books, looking at articles, watching YouTube videos, like different business kind of marketing related things. And then we would just have conversations. And that's where the idea came from for me. I was like, I wonder what it would be like. I feel like a lot of therapists go through a lot of clinical training, but we have this like unique clinical skill set. And I know we're going to talk about podcasting, and that was one of the reasons I chose a podcast, is because I felt like I have all of these years learning how to ask questions, how to listen, how to dive deeper into topics. Why not just use that same skill set into a different medium? And so that's where the idea came from. And then I just thought, what if I just take this clinical skill set and I can create courses and stuff with it? Because it just seems like it's not a huge leap.
This was in which year roughly?
Yeah, this was like 2015, so probably 3 years after I got licensed.
But when you were in that state where you're thinking about a lot of things, where things you had to cancel 22 clients, what was going inside your mind? Did you have some conversations with your family around what's going on in your mind? Because I'm sure like there's a lot of uncertainties there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what was going on in my mind was like, one, I was so scared because fortunately my wife has a full-time salaried position, but at the same time, when here in the US, like when you're buying a house, they want you to put a certain percentage down. And
Right.
so we're trying to save for this 20% down. And so I'm anticipating like, hey, we should be able to get this in X amount of months. And then something like this happens and it crashes it. And honestly, I was just feeling really overwhelmed. I remember
Mm.
like having very bad anxiety to the point where like I had like insomnia. I went through a bout of depression during it
Mm.
as well. And we can definitely like dive into this because I just want to be like open and honest, because I
Right.
think the depression and anxiety is like something I still battle a lot. And even as I build my business, these are things that I think about. Like I realize whether it's trauma or whether it's just how I'm wired, I realize there's a finite amount of responsibility and size of the business I can handle before it takes a toll on my mental health. And so I'm always trying to find that balance.
I have gone through a similar phase. Probably, I'm not sure if I went is as intense as yours, but last year sometime I quit my job, and I was in this phase where I didn't know what to do next. And primarily, I had job offers, but I didn't find anything interesting or exciting. I did a post graduation from a design school in 2015. When I just completed my post grad, I was with all of this excitement, working for multiple different companies, and I'm a kind of person who can find flaws or a contrarian view of every what somebody takes, right? And
Mm.
I started questioning myself. Hey, if I keep going on to this path, there can be nothing that can make me happy. So
Mm.
I was in this phase where I was trying to figure out what gives me happiness rather than getting into a lot more cynical view of the world. I wanted to figure out what does happiness mean to me and what does happiness mean to people, like how do people define happiness, how does the past looked at it. I still feel I'm in that journey where I'm still trying to figure out, rather than equating myself into a common scale in terms of money or in terms of fame or in terms of saying I want to internalize and say that does the work, does the objects or the relationships that I have give me happiness, is for me, I felt like that was a better question to ask. And I have a lot of my friends who have turned entrepreneurs in the last few years. And these never happen on Twitter. These never happen on Instagram. These conversations always happens on a one-on-one, or when you go and meet somebody in a coffee shop. It doesn't even happen in a group. Usually you have to explicitly ping someone and ask, hey, you seem a little off, is everything okay, is when you'll start hearing the story, right? We only glorify like people raising funds and the media celebrating, and they could look like heroes, but definitely there are 100 different decisions that they are battling, both personal front, professional front, and the investor front. And it's quite challenging to just be in that position. It's definitely overwhelming. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you brought up a really good point. I think like when you're in the situation, right? Like it's so hard to take that step back and say, is this the way I want to live my life? That's the question, to be honest. Like I'm asking like with my business because I love what I do, but
Mm.
now I'm in this season and I shared this on a Twitter thread I think about a couple of weeks ago where like multiple income streams, it sounds phenomenal on paper. And even for me, I was like, oh my gosh, wait, I that means I don't have to worry about another snow like blizzard because I've got like other income streams. But the things that I didn't quite realize until I was in it was one, each of those streams, like to some degree, they still require upkeep. So that's one thing. And then depending on how big you've grown, they require their own management. Like, for example, my podcasting course has a community connected to it. It's 250 of my colleagues that are in it. So part of that is I have to check in with them, engage in the community, all of those kind of things. But then I've got a mastermind that I run, I've got a CBC that I run. And so how do you balance these things? And essentially for me, like I realized I had built like a strip mall model, multiple products generating revenue. And now I realize we have a young kid, a young daughter at home. And I realize like so much of what I want to do with my business is build it around my family instead of just putting family like secondary. And what that means is like some sacrifices. And practically, I think what that means is I'm now moving toward, instead of the same multiple income stream kind of idea, I'm actually moving toward just one flagship product and
Right,
just
right.
going all in on it.
That's actually a great point to say that, hey, it's not work versus family. Then you put them together and see that, hey, what could I achieve with them in the picture? It's definitely a very interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Coming
Yeah.
back, I wanted to come back to your journey where, let's say you started taking up like this marketing courses to figure out what to do next. Let's say if someone, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoe. For me, if I had been in an unknown situation, for me, the natural instinct would be to resort something that's already worked. Maybe I could have started a restaurant or I could have done something else like a tested and tried business, right? What nudged you to pick up a route where you started a podcast? And the journey from podcast to the course, now it looks like a natural progression, but I'm sure it was not the case when you started. How did you correlate and why did you start the podcast?
That's a great question. I think probably the best story I have of this is so I was born in Kerala and I spent most of my childhood there. We immigrated to the US right after I had finished first grade. In Kerala, I lived primarily with, we spent a lot of my weekends with my grandparents, and they had this room in the back of their house, which was like a kind of a storage room, but I don't know what they were thinking. I'm glad they thought this like 4-year-old me. So they gave me like tools to play with and hammers and all this stuff like to build. And I remember having and actually we saw the house. They sold it pretty recently, but I had put nails into the walls. So there were all these
Mm,
holes everywhere. But I'm so grateful they did that because I think what why I started a podcast is I realized throughout my life I had been a creator, and when I went to grad school, like I loved it, but that creator part of me was slowly getting lost, and I think the
mm,
podcast was a way to rediscover something. And so that's what I mean made me pick it. Practically what made me pick it is a lot of therapists are they're very strong with audio skills, and so I
mm,
thought the medium I thought was would be good. And then also a lot of therapists have 45-minute sessions, and so
mhm.
they have that 15-minute gap, so it's a quick listen to on between sessions. They can be writing up case notes and listen to a podcast. They can multitask on that, or they can do it on a morning commute or while they're exercising or something. So those were the reasons. And then the other reason I picked in 2015, no, like very few people knew what a podcast was, right? But I could tell
Right.
like there was some potential there. There were companies that were starting to get into it. And I thought this might be really interesting to get early on into a medium before
Mm,
it gets so saturated. And
mm.
that's was like the motivation. So
Right, right. I really like how you thought from the end listener's perspective. Like you have weaved your medium into the fabric of life, and you've decided that, hey, maybe that 15 minutes sort of the time where they write case notes is a place where you could introduce like a podcast. So once you've selected, let's say, the podcast as a medium, how did you figure out like the technology, right? Whom did
Yeah.
you reach out to? Whom did you look up to in the podcasting world? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. I primarily listened to John Lee Dumas, EO Fire, Entrepreneur on Fire. He actually had a podcasting course, and so I ended up taking that course. And then I listened to and follow like Pat Flynn, smartpassiveincome.com. And those were, I would say, the two major kind of people. There was a conference called Podcast Movement that was starting in the US in 2015, 2016. And so
Mhm.
I went to the first couple of them, and
Mhm.
I remember the first one was like made 300, 400 people, which is still a good amount of people. But
Yeah.
the next year was like triple that. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like all these people do podcasts. And yeah, those are the people. I'm a big believer that it's such an act of humility to say you don't know something and just to try to learn from people. Even I've done this podcasting now since 2015, and there's just so many things that I am still learning. I'll even share like a funny story. I use like a Rodecaster Pro for my mixer, and our daughter came in the other day, so I let her play with all of my equipment because I want her
Mhm.
to foster that creativity. She turned something off that I have no idea what. I didn't know how to get it back. And so I'm on this podcast conversation not realizing this thing had been turned off. And
Yeah.
the guest is, I can't hear you properly. There's like this echo. I don't know what my daughter turned off, but something is off and I'm trying to figure it out. And I don't know, the medium and all of this, it still keeps you humble.
Yeah. 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 Awesome. So when you started the podcast, how did you decide what is going to be your tone, what is going to be your topics that you're going to pick up?
Yeah. Yeah. The general idea was, you know what, like most therapists don't take business or marketing classes. So how do we
Mhm.
learn? So I thought the best way was let me interview successful therapists in private practice who are already doing this. Let me ask them like what's working for them, how they get referrals, what books have been instrumental for them, those kind of things. So I thought, and then I thought, you know what? Let me figure out an interview like other marketing, business, like social media type folks as well. And
Mhm.
then yeah, I didn't do this initially, but as I was learning stuff and building my business, I just started doing like solo episodes as well, where I was like, hey guys, this week I'm trying to figure this out. The general perspective I take is like I tell a lot of story. It's very casual. It's not so, even though in my mind it's structured with questions, I try to like really see the humanity in people. And
Mhm.
when we do these interviews, what I'm really trying to go for is not like the surface level answers, but these deep human moments, you know? So,
Right. So usually, let's say you're doing it on YouTube, right? YouTube has this way of a real-time feedback. So, for example, somebody is commenting, you have their picture, your name to it.
yeah.
I'm sure it's a good thing and also a bad thing,
Uh,
but you know that there's some sort of a feedback that you're getting, right? Usually, podcast is a much more democratized medium. You have no idea where they're listening from and which mediums they listen. How did you know that the stuff that you're doing was actually working?
Yeah, so I got initially I got a good indicator because the podcast got into like the new and noteworthy section of as one of their new podcasts. So I was like, oh, there must be interesting because honestly, the first day was I had 9 downloads, and I'm pretty sure three of those were my own like family members, right? So it
Right.
wasn't, and that's like probably being a little conservative. It was probably closer to like 70%. It slowly started growing. You can, so you know, with podcasting, there's something called podcast hosts, which is basically
Mhm.
where you house your podcast, right? With videos, you put it on YouTube, podcasts, you put it on these podcast hosts, and these hosts then send it out to Spotify and Apple and Google and all of these
Right.
places. So I could look at the analytics and I could see it was not like a crazy growth, but it was like trending up. And I thought this is really interesting. I also, at just before I had launched my podcast in the past months before, I had been active on Facebook groups of therapists. Honestly, I didn't even know that existed until I got into them, and I could tell, I had befriended a couple of the creators of those groups, and I could tell anytime I gave like updates on, hey guys, I purchased my first mic and this is how I'm setting it up. Everybody was getting like really excited and curious about it. And I that was like some early indicators. And then I also realized just weren't a lot of therapists creating podcasts at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I just
Mm-hmm.
thought it could be I like that book Blue Ocean Strategy. And I thought
Right.
there's a blue ocean here and let me try to figure out, what I can do in it.
So you also had a community along with the podcast. If I'm not wrong, that was a Facebook group where therapists could interact. When did that start? Like, how did that idea of starting a community along with your podcast start?
Yeah, you're probably giving me way more credit than this was like a kind of a spontaneous idea. So I
Right.
thought, hey, exactly the thing you said, right? Like podcasts, like people listen to them, but then
Mhm.
I thought, but there's no way to talk about it. And so why don't I just create a group? So I invited, I think like 42 or 43 of my friends from grad school, like people that I just connected with. And I was like, hey guys, I created this Facebook group. Maybe we can just talk about these episodes and learn from each other. And that's where it started. And they started sharing the group with others, and those folks started sharing it with others. And so
Mhm.
right now I think we're just under 10,000 in that group.
All along this journey, were you able to monetize your podcasts?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm.
That was the biggest fear that I had
Mm.
because, and honestly, that's why from 2015 to 2019, I was doing this like part time every day. Like pretty much every year, I would pull back one clinical day, and
Mhm.
I was down to one clinical day in 2019. But in 2015, honestly, I was doing this as a side thing. I would get up at 3:30 in the morning, do the podcast, write blog posts, think about solo episodes. I'd go to work at 7:30, come back around 5, try to record like interviews after, all that kind of stuff. I wasn't sure if it could be monetized, but fortunately, I had some ideas because like it's a business-based podcast for therapists, and so I saw that there were companies that were advertising website design, electronic health records, and that kind of stuff. It took a couple of years. So I launched my online course. I launched the podcast in March of 2015. I launched my online course in November of 2015, and it wasn't making a ton of money. People were buying the podcasting course, so it was getting monetized in that way indirectly. We took on sponsors it's been about 4 years now. So I started that, and I was terrified to do this, but I started initially at 2000 US dollars. And then the following year, we like almost doubled it, I think, to 3,500. Currently, we're at 5,000 a month for sponsorships. So what that
Right.
basically means is these companies reach out to us, and then we run ads for them
Mhm.
on the podcast.
Right. Right. Which was the first time you were able to monetize your side hustle? Was it using the course or was it using ad sponsorship?
It was actually affiliate income.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, that's how I actually did the first one because I wrote a tax write-off checklist for
Mm-hmm.
therapists because a lot of therapists don't know what to write off and what. And I put like affiliate links for like FreshBooks in there,
Mm-hmm.
which is like an accounting platform. And
Right.
that was the first way. And then I had a resource page on the blog, and it's still there. Honestly, like I haven't, the blog, like visually, I don't think it's that great. Like we're going to improve it, but that's literally what I did. It just had a resource page, and I said, hey, these are the things that I'm using to build out my business. And that's kind of how we monetized it. And then I think the final way is I wrote a blog post called, what is it, the DIY guide to creating your private practice website. And it would have
Mm-hmm.
like affiliate links to like website hosting and stuff
Right.
like that. So I created like, high value sort of content. And then that's how we initially monetized.
Interesting. Interesting. Can you talk about the first ad sponsorship that you did? How did you decide the pricing? How
Yeah.
did they even reach out to you?
Yeah. So all thus far, it's been all word of mouth. Like I didn't know like I'm trying to remember I can't remember who my first sponsor was, but they had heard the podcast for a number of months and had been listening in, and it was Yeah, and they were like, hey, we were interested in sponsoring the podcast. Tell us what that means. And I looked and I was like, man, that's crazy. I knew that I wanted to cover the cost of editing because I have an editor and that's 350 US dollars a month. And then I wanted to try to get up to at least 50% of my 40 to 50% of my clinical salary. And so that's where like I started and it was like at the 2000 a month. I realized this is something I've learned on the creator journey. Like everybody is entitled to an opinion, but not everybody's opinion should have equal weight in your business world. So I found a small group of people that were way more successful than me that were also like in the therapist business sort of space. And I reach out to them and I form these connections with them and they kept telling me like, Mel, like you're way undercharging for this. And I was like, oh, but 2000 is a lot of money. And yeah, that's kind of how it went. They fortunately were like really happy with the sponsorship because the thing we do with sponsorship is I don't it's not today's podcast is sponsored by Thousand Faces Club. It's not like this generic like read, right? Like I weave in a lot of story and generally I meet with the sponsors, so I talk about what we talked about. I listen to a lot of National Public Radio NPR podcasts, and a lot of them weave story into the podcast, like ad reads.
Right,
And so I try to do
right.
that same thing. Because of that, I think we've generally had like repeat sponsors year after
Mm-hmm.
year. The same ones come back.
Right, right, right. How did it feel when someone agreed to sponsor this video and the money actually hit your bank? What was the feeling like?
Yeah, unreal. Like you feel excited and then it's, oh my gosh, did this really happen? I still remember when it hit PayPal, when I got that PayPal notification and you're like, and it happened. I remember, I think this is the podcast sponsor. They're on a different time zone. So it had happened like when it was evening here. And so I logged in on my email and the next morning and I was like, I saw it pop up and I was like, that's so crazy. Like literally I was not working
Mhm.
and $2,000 came in. I think it just shifted. I don't know. I feel like there's a great quote that guides a lot of like how I think about things, which is it's from I forgot her name, the founder of Spanx. She says, do you guys know that is I forgot the name. I forgot her name at the moment. But she says wealth or money makes you more of who you. So if
Mhm.
you're a kind and generous person and you become and you have more financial resources, it just accentuates that. But if you're a mean person, a jerk, then if you have wealth, generally it tends to make you more stingy or whatever it is. And that was actually so liberating for me because I had one of the biggest things I've actually struggled with as a creator is I have this sort of like upper limit kind of thing. Like a psychologist should only make this much per year. And if they
Mhm.
exceed that, like somehow in my mind, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like a fraud. Like this
Mhm.
isn't
Mhm.
fair that I'm making this. But then I
Right.
just realized so I can share this with you guys. So my partner and I we met on a humanitarian trip to New Orleans, which was hit by
Mhm.
Hurricane Katrina. We spent a week down there helping rebuild a community center. And so like mission and service, all of this stuff has been really important to me. I actually spent a month in Bombay, India, and
Mhm.
working for this NGO in the red light district. So they rescue women and children from the commercial sex trade. And so even for us, like the next sort of step in the business journey is we're planning on creating like a private charitable foundation where we can actually give like significant amounts of money back to girls' education to so that girls around the world have opportunities that, for example, like our daughter has here. And that's what makes me like the most happy. It's not at
Mhm.
some point you realize, and I'm not like making some crazy amount of money or anything, but to be completely honest, like we're both like pretty simple people, so my we pretty much live like on the salary I made as a postdoc still. This is
Mhm.
11 years later and then we like invest the rest and then now we give back. And so I just realized like my lifestyle is not really increasing. I'm not really that type of person. I think what makes me more happy is if we are given these resources, then we can give it back to the world.
That's actually great. There are very few sort of times I personally get to hear about kindness and wealth together. It's usually the opposite. And thanks for sharing that. And it definitely gives I'm sure it gives a lot of confidence and like a good vibe to a lot of people thinking about money. I did have the same feeling. So, for example, when as a sort of consultant, when I tell a certain client that, hey, this is how much I'm charging, at some point in time, I go back to think this is probably a very Indian thing. Like you think about your parents, hey, probably this is what your parents would have earned for half the year, right? You're earning it this in 1 month. How responsible are you? Or this is something you don't even deserve. And then I still do get that feeling, right? But like you said, beyond a point, for me, materialistic stuff doesn't give me happiness. For me, happiness comes probably from sharing knowledge or helping folks or doing something which actually does not involve money, right? I keep telling even my wife saying that, hey, I feel more happy when I hang out with my friends and have a good breakfast than when I go out and probably get another project or there is one more money that hits my bank, right? So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
No, you're so welcome. I'm so glad you shared that too. I don't know if you've come across there's a palliative care nurse, Bronnie Ware. I think she's based in Australia. Have you come across
Mhm.
her work at all?
No.
So she interviewed basically hundreds of people on their deathbed and asked them
Mhm.
what their biggest regrets were. And
Mhm.
like the number one regret was like none of it focused, like the top five, none of them focused on money. All of them focused on relationships. Like I wish I had invested more in my relationships as opposed to like
Mhm.
working and all of that kind of stuff. And that always spoke to me,
Yeah,
especially I
okay.
think as creators, right? Like it's so easy to focus on social media following, revenue, email list
Right.
size, all of that kind of stuff. But what really brings contentment?
I haven't followed her work, but there's a very beautiful YouTube video. I keep watching it again and again. It's about where they went and interviewed like a bunch of folks who are 100 plus years old, both men and women. And probably they've seen like multiple things. They've seen World War II and they've seen the economic crisis and all of it, and they go back and ask what's the secret of a happy, and it's exactly resonates the same stuff that you said, right? Everybody talks about a good, I remember like one person talked about, hey, for me a good day is essentially when I take a walk, hang out with my friends and have a couple of whiskeys and come back, and that makes a great day. And there was this lady who talked about saying that all the memories that I probably share with my family. And she talked about how she's very proud that she could see the first generation. And she was also a little sad that she had to see her daughter die before she
Mhm.
could. But there was no regrets. And it was just them cherishing memories all along. Probably I will check out her work too.
Yeah, I definitely want to see this video. It sounds
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah. I'll send it to you. Yeah, I'll send it to you. Yeah. Coming back, I want to touch a little bit upon the courses. So you had created these courses, and for me, it's very interesting because usually people do the podcast. Let's say if you're doing the podcast, they do it for years before they launch a course, right? Now, in your case, you started the course somewhere in the beginning of 2015, and you launched a course in end of 2015. What gave you that confidence to say that, hey, this is the right time for me to launch a course?
yeah,
And
that's a
also,
great
please tell
question.
us what is the course about.
Oh, yeah, sure. The course is a podcasting course for therapists, right? So
Mhm.
therapist business owners basically, yeah, that to launch and grow a successful podcast. What made me launch it? Because between March when I launched and November, or March when I launched the podcast and November when I launched the course, there were colleagues reaching out to me wanting to do one-on-one consults and being willing to pay me for help with launching their podcasts. And I thought, how can I do this? And that was the simple kind of idea. So I had some of those initial colleagues and I ran the idea by them and they were like, oh my gosh, this would be so helpful. And so I used them as initial like beta reviewers and everything. And yeah, that was like the best validation is if someone's willing to pay you for something.
Yeah, right, right. Interesting, interesting. I do have a lot more questions to ask, but there are definitely a few topics which I wanted to cover. I didn't want to miss that. Can we talk a little bit about the creator money? Currently, what are your sort of income sources and which of them probably give you a larger revenue share?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now I have my Healthcaster is my podcasting course, which is
Mhm.
a traditional digital course. I run a CBC called Online Course School, which basically teaches therapists how to create their course. So it's a course on courses, but it's live. And then I run a basically a mastermind for therapists who are who have established courses or podcasts, but now want to be in a community of other therapists as they grow those. From a revenue model, like I just looked at the numbers like 2 weeks ago, so it's like fresh on my mind. The mastermind is brand new. This year we launched this. That is right now accounting for almost like 70% of our revenue, and which was it's been pretty crazy. And I think it's a higher ticket offer. We charge $497 a month US dollars. They have to commit for a year. And what I've realized is I love doing the mastermind too.
Mhm.
There's just such a new challenge. And we also have like a lot of different criteria to be part of that mastermind. Like you have to have been a business owner for 5 years, you have to be clearing six figures, like all of these kind of things. So you get these like very innovator, successful people in the mastermind. So yeah, that's essentially what I'm going to double down on. And the thing I'm trying to now figure out, which I think I've got it figured out, is how does the CBC and the digital course weave into the mastermind? And I think what they will probably be is just they'll get put into the mastermind. And so we'll just have different pricing tiers.
Currently, the mastermind is just a community, if I understand.
Yeah, so it's common. That's a great question. So we meet weekly over
Mhm.
Zoom. So depending on what week it is, we do different things. So sometimes we do like hot seats, right? Like
Mhm.
traditional. Others we do like we bring in a guest expert. For example, we just had one of my friends who came in and talked about like investing. He's Harvard Business School all and was on Wall Street for 20 years. We just had that. And then the one of the weeks we do open office hours. So basically I hired, so I do the one on online courses. Essentially, they come into a Zoom room, they can pick what room they go into. I do the one on online courses, but then we have other ones, one on podcasting, one on creator mindset, and then another one like legal and ethical. So we have an attorney that comes in and helps therapists figure out that the legal stuff that they had to figure out as they enter the online realm. So that's the gist of it. So we do online meetings. We have community on Circle where we gathered outside of the meetings, and then we also just started Voxer, which is
Mhm.
the audio chat.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's the combo of it. And I love the mastermind, but there are so many moving pieces where
Yeah.
practically I'm like, man, I gotta like really lock down on this and get it like nice and
Right.
systematized here.
That was going to be my next question. Like, how are you doing it alone? Or do you have a team?
Yeah, so I have a director of operations. She and I have
Mhm.
worked together for 5 years. So it's mainly I don't want a big team. I want what I call like a lean and mighty team. I have a podcast editor, I have my director of operations, I have a website person, and I have a bookkeeper. That's like the major stuff. We're going to be doing a couple of different hires now, like an SEO person, and then probably like a marketing folks that can help us like create digital assets, editing, graphics, that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's the gist of it. And I in actually creating this mastermind, one of the questions I asked myself, and I would have not asked myself this before, but when I was starting, but I said, who else can do this besides me? And that's the question that I operated around because I realized like part of my strength is being able to vision and take on that entrepreneurial mind and say, this is where I see the mastermind going, and these are the structures we need to put into place. I love being in the weeds and being there, but I realize if I do too much of that, I'll step back as
Yeah.
I should to let it grow.
Yeah. How does that question help? Who else could do this? What does that question help you answer?
So that's because I think for me, m- my natural tendency is to jump in and try to figure out how to do it. So my
Yeah.
natural tendency is not, let me see if I can get some help, or even asking, is this a wise move as a CEO, right? Like
Mhm.
that question does not come naturally. And I think asking that question fosters more of that.
So at this point in time, do the all the activities that you're doing, do you see it more of a structured organization than a side hustle? Probably this started as a side hustle, like you would have
Yep.
thought about, hey, this is just me doing it. Because as we talk through your journey, like by the end of this, you're talking about we and not me.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's where I'm trying to understand. Are you
yeah.
looking at this more like an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at this point, when the pandemic started, I was down to 1 day of clinical work.
Mhm.
And just to even be transparent, so the place I was doing the clinical work, they wanted me to come in and just like within 2 weeks of the pandemic. And I knew we have a young baby at home
Mhm.
and there was like no ventilation in that room. And I knew that I was going to get COVID if I went back in there. no vaccines available, nothing at that point. I just made the leap then, and since then it has been like a we because I
Yeah.
realize I can't do this on my own. And I work 4 days a week so that I can do like daddy daughter days on Fridays with our little
Mhm.
one. And then we do spend time as a family on weekends. And we talked earlier about building life around family and what the most meaningful stuff is. And that's what I realized, like time with
Right.
my daughter, with my wife, my daily hike and my naps and my time to just learn. That's like the most fun
Right.
stuff for me.
Even on the days that you work, do you have a fixed time where you say, this is my work time, this is my sort of family time?
Yeah.
Because usually if you're working for an organization, it becomes easier, right? They say,
Yeah.
hey, you're here 9 to 5. And probably when you come out at 5, you are switching off your mind, right? But when you're a creator, the lines largely blur, right? You could be thinking about it while watching a TV, while eating, while walking, anytime, right? How are you handling it?
Yeah, I realized very quickly I needed structure because of what you just described. And
Right.
yeah, so generally what I do is I do deep work in the morning. So from 9
Mm-hmm.
a.m. to 1 p.m. is interviews like this. I run my mastermind during this time, do podcast interviews, any of that kind of stuff. 9 to 1 o'clock, I do a hike for 45 minutes, come back, grab a quick shower, do a 25-minute power nap. I take a nap 7 days. I grew up because we went back to India, like back to Kerala most summers, even as I was growing up. But my grandfather like napped every day, so I just got used to that. So I just take
Right.
7 day a week nap, and then I wrap up my day with 2 days or 2 hours of either I call it sacred writing time or sacred learning time. So
Mm-hmm.
some days I write Twitter threads, other days I'm just like learning. I think today's like my podcasting days, spending an hour just learning about podcasting. Yeah. So
Right, right.
and then I
Good.
wrap up at 5 and then family time for the rest of the evening.
I think I'm gonna steal that schedule. It sounds very exciting to me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I like it. It's a good schedule. It
Yeah.
allows you to do deep work and then also like introvert as well, and then
Yeah.
focus also on exercise and sleep and all
Right.
that. So
Right. Right. I think we're almost out of time. So just to complete some of the thoughts, if you had to go back and relive yours, restart your journey, are there some things that you would do differently?
yeah, I would get out of my head more, because
What
I
does it
think
mean?
I'm meaning that I spend so many hours and hours analyzing and reanalyzing before I take a step forward. And I would just learn to trust my gut more, my instincts more, because I think what I was realizing is so much of what I was doing initially, like with the podcasting course, actually, no, with the podcast, I sat on that idea for 5 months before I launched it in March because I thought, who's going to listen to this? But I think for us, like us creators, we're in that sort of most people keep things in their head and they never actually do it, right?
Right.
But for us, we're actually taking the step. And I think there's something really powerful in that and just trusting that you either have the intellectual capacity or the resources or the community that can help you. And I think that's been the
Yeah.
most empowering thing.
When you started this conversation, there's one thing that really struck me is where you said you started for me, I still feel that they were not doubts, and probably I look at them as curiosity because at every phase you have taken something and you made it, you've been a little curious about how to crack this. And even though if it's one of its first of its kind, you sort of like converted probably your doubts into curiosity to crack it. And I think that's going to be like a big takeaway, at least for me personally, through this conversation is, hey, the journey from doubts to curiosity. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I like that. I like that phrasing. I didn't thought of it in that way. That's great.
So we've come to this end of the session. It was great having you. Would you want to share some thoughts or do you have some questions for us? Happy to take them.
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I'm just honestly so grateful to connect with other creators. And I think especially as like Indian creator doing atypical sort of stuff. I think that
Hmm.
is just, it's nice to have a community. And I feel like we're all gifted in different ways. And I think the best thing that we can all do to honor ourselves and to honor the world is to own those gifts.
Yeah. So me and Rajesh, we keep talking about it. So in India, just largely 5% of the people are like employed. Most of them are like self-employed. They could be running like a grocery store. They could be running like a small shop. or they could be independent, like they could be lecturers, they could be dancers, dance teachers, and stuff like that. For me, being a creator feels like the online version of the offline behavior, like running a small business. And in India, since just given the art diversity and the culture and this thing, the amount of unique skill sets or like the unique talents that you could mint here is just tremendous. It's just about time we see the rise of a lot more Indian creators who not only can give you like the quantity, like the number of people, but also the variety, like the number of folks who could mix multiple sort of things. And I'm sure you've seen these small clip people with extraordinary skill sets, who someone who cuts cabbage in 3 seconds, or someone who sort of is moving bricks in a very structured sort of manner in a construction. And I think in India, everybody figures out a hack to how to live their life here. So how to live it more efficiently, more happily in all of it. I think even just documenting them would be like a great thing on internet. And I'm really looking forward for a lot more creators online share their talents.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Melvin. Thanks a lot for joining us with this session. Have a great day.
Bye. You too.